My name is Laurel Jones. I'm the president here at Cabrillo College, and I am welcoming all of you to this very unique discussion that will be happening tonight. I want to thank the Owl Family Properties for their generous sponsorship. So thank you again for making this wonderful historical evening possible. You know that you're in our hearts. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Thomas Steinbeck and Sandy Lydon and Jeffrey Dunn, who will be our moderator for this evening. Have fun.
My name is Jeffrey Dunn, and it is one of the great honors of my life to be here tonight with these two gentlemen, two icons of this region. And really, I want to thank Cabrillo for hosting this event. There are a few people I want to thank here tonight, and we can't see out there very well. Is Topsy Smalley here? Where is she? Topsy, hello. Now, I don't know if we've ever formally met because I can't see that far, but everyone today told me this was her brainchild this evening. So we thank you for having that inspiration and for guiding it through to fruition. So we're off and running tonight, okay? I also, thank you. I also saw Melinda Silverstein. Where's Melinda? The head of the community Cabrillo Foundation. And I just want to say about the Cabrillo Foundation, Sandy and I were discussing it today. It's really one of the premier community college foundations in the United States, and wonderful for all you do for the community. And Cabrillo is such a central part of this community. We thank you for coordinating and making sure this evening happened tonight. Okay? I also want to ask, I got to see, maybe he's here, maybe is John Lee here? Huh? Where is he? John! Okay. We'll get to the kind of connective tissue here tonight, but John is the son of two Chinese pioneers, Xingxi Li and Guixi Li, and it's a really joy to have you here as part of that continuing thread. So, John, thank you for making it tonight. Always a pleasure to see you. Going to do very quick intros here, and certainly Sandy Lydon needs no introduction. That's what guys who don't want to introduce people say. It's easier to do that, and he really doesn't. We were just discussing, he's taught at Cabrillo for nearly 50 years, okay? And he's still teaching. And he's brought to this region and to Santa Cruz County, but to the region, a sense of its own history. And for me personally, a sense of my family's own history. And I want to thank him personally and for the community for that gift. We are eternally grateful. Thank you, sir. All right, I know a lot of you know this, and I probably most of you have all read Chinese magnificent work, Chinese Gold. For those of you who don't have it, all these books are for sale tonight in the back. You got a chance to have them signed by both of these gentlemen. And books are important, okay? They really are important. I'm trying to convince my younger children of that, and it's a struggle, but I believe in them passionately. And having dealt with some of life's challenges, I can only say that when you get down, books matter, all right? Sandy's also written The Japanese in the Monterey Bay region, A Brief History. How many people have SoCal Landing to Capitola by the Sea? I got it when they first handed it out at the bank on 41st Avenue, and it was the first non-baseball book I ever read, okay? And I still have it, and I lived in SoCal, went to SoCal High, and it was like an entry into my own backyard. Okay, my backyard literally was Soquel Creek, and so if you can find a copy, I encourage you. He also was a co-op, huh? You can get it on eBay, or ABE Books. He also wrote along growing up on Grove Street, Coast Redwood, and he and I worked on a book called Chinatown Dreams, The Life and Photographs of George Lee, who was Jun's brother, and who was the uncle of many people here tonight, including our dear friend George Au, who was thanked already, so we promised we wouldn't thank him again. Okay? And I want to note, because this is also important, I believe in regional history and where people were raised. Sandy is an alumna of Hollister High, a proud one as well, okay? Now, go Baylors. All right. Now, the man on my left attended Pacific Grove High. How many of you knew that? Tom Steinbeck, where my son is playing basketball tomorrow. And we've got at least one other PG alumna here tonight. And he is also an author of books that when I first read, I was, wow, there's a synergy going on here, and particularly down to A Soundless Sea, In the Shadow of the Cypress, The Silver Lotus, and a book that I haven't read yet and I am dying to read, and we may discuss a little bit later, In Search of the Dark Watchers, Landscapes and Lore of Big Sur. And if some of you know what the Dark Watchers are, keep it to yourself for now. We'll get to that, and if you don't, we'll get to it in a little bit, okay? We're only supposed to be up here for an hour and a half. I think we're going to go late. So, someone tell me when we're at 8 o'clock, okay? All right. In Chinese Gold, there's a passage that I cite frequently, and I want to start back there again. And to me, it's really one of the more important passages in American historical writing. That's right, I said American historical writing. On a national scale, this story has that significance. And Sandy wrote this: though the Chinese are not explicitly mentioned in the local and regional histories, if you hold each page to the light, you can make out a faint pattern. The longer you look, the stronger the pattern becomes. The Chinese are in the very paper. They are the watermark. The watermark. As I look out in this crowd tonight, I see the watermark in this room. Tom, a lot of your writings deal with the history of the Chinese in this region. How did you personally become interested in Chinese history in Central California?
I guess the happiest year in school I ever spent was at PGI. One, because earlier than that, my father was sending me off to expensive prison camps all over the East Coast. And I didn't find out for years why, but it doesn't make any difference in this conversation. At any rate, one of the reasons I loved PGI so much is because you can meet girls there. You can't meet girls at private boys' schools. And I remember, I can't believe that we don't have them these days, but we had a football team. My God, have you ever heard of such a thing? And we had a metal shop, and we had a carpenter's shop, and we had biology classes with Bunsen burners for 35 kids. It was just unbelievable. I thought this is like the best school in the world, and it really was, for me, the best school in the world. My two best friends at that school were two Chinese boys who, for the name and for the dignity of their family, I will not mention their names. I want to hold the dignity together, but we were the best of friends, and one of the reasons that I knew that they really liked me was because their parents hated me with a passion. And it took me years to find out why, because they were so polite. And so I said, why is it your parents never liked me? And they said, very simple, you're not Chinese. And that made a lot of sense to me, because ultimately the Chinese in California, or the Chinese basically, where they came in all over the country, kept it together by virtue of their sense of family. And I remember a quote I once heard, a lovely Chinese gentleman that I'd met, a teacher. He said, birds have nests, humans have families. Well, I have to thought about that. And indeed, the Chinese consider themselves linguistic families. There's Cantonese, that's a whole family of speaking, of poetry, of music, of art, and Mandarin. There's another whole school of art and thinking and poetry and magic. And you're either one or the other, but either way, you're a family man. So that's how I got to be involved with the Chinese here. Not only that, but my father was fascinated by them, especially when he learned that there probably wasn't a tunnel built anywhere in California that wasn't mined and dug by the Chinese. He was also fascinated by the fishing industry. Most people don't know this, but if you find early photographs of Monterey Bay and you look in the distance, you'll see nothing but junks out there. Junks were built here in Monterey. They were also built in my present hometown, Santa Barbara. I was stunned to learn that. I thought only the Spanish were building ships there. Not true at all. Chinese were building junks there. But the most interesting part about that idea of junks being built is, I think even to this day we have a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, a feeling about Chicanos in pickup trucks, right? Which is not exactly the most enlightened. In the meantime, in the days of sail, the Chinese and their junks were the short-haul truckers of California. And for two really brilliant reasons that the Chinese invented. One was the anchor stone, brilliant idea. Two was the fact that they were junk rigged, and that takes a whole evening of explanation. But junks carried 4 anchors, one at every corner of the junk. And if you understand how the land grants were set up in California with the original Spanish land grants, you realize that everybody who got a land grant got a little hunk of the ocean, a little hunk of the mountains, a little hunk of everything going inland all the way to Salinas Valley. So you got over the mountains and into the valleys. But if you wanted anything big delivered, livestock or machinery or anything, the only way you could bring it into this part of California was by ship. That was it. But it couldn't be a keeled vessel. I mean, it couldn't be like a modern European ship. It had to be a Chinese junk for one very important reason, and that was it had to be grounded. It had to be pulled up onto the beach. And what the Chinese would do, this is brilliant, I love this. They would come coasting into the shore, and at a very specific moment, they would let go the 2 rear anchor stones to drop into the water and then pay it out. The junk would come up on the shore. Now, this is at high tide. Then they wait for the tide to go out, and the junk would rest on solid ground. They'd unload all the heavy stuff they needed to unload at low tide. And then, during high tide again, they would wait till the boat just barely floated and then crank in the outer anchors, thus pulling the ship off to sea again. Well, that principle of refloating a boat wasn't used again until the Second World War on landing craft, which were built exactly the same way. They were bluff-bowed, they were square-fronted, bluff-bowed. They had 4 anchor systems that could pull themselves off the shore. And I said, this is really quite remarkable. And I finally got to understand, to some degree, that everything I ever heard about the Chinese is everything that's old is new again. I can't think of one major invention that we use in the West in terms of industry, in terms of metal making. I can't think of anything that the Chinese weren't doing before we were doing it. Not one thing. After the food's great. But foundry work, pottery work, basket work, silk. Can you imagine, silk? And I know people who are really sort of into the Japanese a lot. Everything the Japanese got, they got from the Chinese. Everything. Silk making, printing, the compass, the rudder. The Chinese were using rudders aboard their ships, and some of them were gigantic, millenniums before anybody thought of using a rudder in Europe. We used oars. They were called. I just finished reading a book about them. They were called salons. I don't know why, but they were called salons. But it was, the same kind of steerage mechanism that was used on Viking ships. It was an oar that you pushed forward or pulled back to make the junk turn. I said, that can't be right. Yeah, it was. And I just kept on enjoying it and enjoying it and enjoying it. And everything I learned about the Chinese in California just taught me more and more and more, which is one of the reasons I started writing about it, because it was so fascinating to me. Like, I had no idea the Chinese were, because they were used constantly in gold mining projects, how much gold they were getting away with. It was really big. They'd take the tailings from a mine. Placer mining. Do you know what placer mining is? Where water's used to hose down a cliff face or something, and they get the biggest pieces of gold, and then whatever's left is called tailings, and it's sort of thrown away. Well, the Chinese invented a process which I've always just thrilled me. They would get whale oil in a jar, and they take just spoonfuls at a time of the placer tailings and drop it into the whale oil. Well, the gold would sink to the very, very bottom of the whale oil, and the placer, the dirt, would just stay in suspension. Doing this, some people claim that the Chinese walked off with maybe $200,000 or $300,000 worth of gold, when indeed they were being paid next to nothing for their skills as miners, of which they were penultimately brilliant. They were used all over the Big Sur, was it called the Salinas Land and Mining Company? It was very famous because infamous because they imported illegal Chinese laborers into the mines. And on one particular occasion, they imported some Chinese that were carrying the plague. And when they found out about it, they walled them up down in a mine shaft in the Big Sur. Interesting stuff for a writer.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I'm going to turn it over to Sandy
you
for a
like
second.
Chinese
No,
too?
I have never got to ask Sandy this question, and I want to ask him the same question. You grew up in Hollister, you're around the region.
Now, that's the second time you've brought that up.
I love it there, man.
Yeah,
Hey.
I'm wearing my hay
Okay.
buckle.
I know.
Okay.
No. But it's the same question, and I'll relate it back to this. One of Sandy's points that he makes, it's a brilliant point in Chinese gold, is that the Chinese worked the margins of the economy wherever they were because they were forced to, and they became successful at it. So they did what Tom just said. So my question to you, though, is when did that story capture you and become part of your imagination?
Well, I was a math and science guy in high school. I got the Bank of America Award in math and science, and I was going on, and I went to Davis as a physics major. And I do this for the edification of all of you who are reformed physics majors. Minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now, I have no idea what that is, but it's something quadratic, and it's in my head, and I can't get it out. And there are math teachers here, so it's all right. So I was at Davis, and playing baseball, minding my own business, and not having a good time as a physics major at all. And there seemed to be no sense of humor in the physics department. And a lot of long necks, and nobody was having a good time. So I was in a bookstore. I got a book of Japanese and Chinese poetry in translation. Now here I'm a jock, okay? So I'm reading this at night under the covers in the dormitory because you're not, I mean, if anybody'd seen me reading this, you know, there goes my batting average, all right? So I became very interested in the literature, and you have to remember that this is late 50s, 60s, and China was a place you couldn't go, and there were a lot of things going on at that time. So I started messing with the historical stuff. This was all China-centered, in China, not here. And started teaching high school, invented a class on Chinese history. We actually made it a requirement. The school district had no idea what we were doing, and we were getting away with murder. It was wonderful. And in that process, as I began to teach myself Chinese history, because they didn't teach Chinese history at Davis when I was there.
Probably not at Hollister High either.
No, not at Hollister High School either. And as a result, you know, there was a scholarship offered at the East-West Center in Honolulu, and I thought, well, that sounds cool. And so I was accepted, and I was one of 25 high school teachers in the country. And again, middle 60s, so we had to pick a language. And the language I picked was Japanese, partly because they were teaching Mandarin, and in 1965, there'd be nobody to talk to because you couldn't go to China. All right, and they weren't teaching Cantonese. So my language training was in Japanese, but I continued to work on the, so I'm in Honolulu, and they're talking about the paradise of the Pacific and how wonderful it all is, and I'm all of a sudden noticing that maybe that's not quite the way it really works. So I started doing research on the Chinese in Hawaii, and I did my master's on the anti-Chinese movement in Hawaii. I was not a very popular person, because the paradise of the Pacific, you know, you weren't supposed to be talking about that. And then Richard Nixon did the thing, which who could have predicted that, and immediately set us loose and able to go to China. But it seemed to me that traditional China, the kind of China that we had read about, didn't exist in mainland China anymore. Yep. That Mao had changed everything. So you could find it in the new territories, you could find it in Hong Kong, maybe in Singapore, but here in California, where the culture was still pretty much what it had been previously. So it started with a book, mm-hmm. And it just sort of led, you know, as they say, down the rabbit hole. And what I discovered was that it was a transferable subject, because in California, every place you are, every place you dig, we learned as kids, right? What happens if you dig a hole? You end up in China. That's what they taught. Right. That's what they taught us.
Absolutely.
Now, if you look at a globe, that doesn't work. You know, you end up in some place like Fiji or somewhere. It doesn't. You know, if you actually took, you know, made a hole through the globe, I don't think it works to go to China. Wrong hemisphere, among other things.
Yeah.
But what I discovered was when I came back from Hawaii and then came here to Santa Cruz County in '68, that as we start to dig a hole, the Chinese strata is everywhere in California. They're absolute, they're the underpinning, if you will, of the whole thing. And so in order to do that story justice, I had to do the whole history of the joint, because there wasn't anything, there was no frame. And from that, you know, came the book. But it was also gaining a trust of the community. Obviously, not being Chinese and having the same experience that Tom had, that the initial response is, you know, what are you going to do with this? You know, right? There was and they had no reason to trust because of all the experiences that they'd had. But once I was able to convince people in the Chinese community that I meant them no harm, and that actually I was trying to illuminate some things about them that had never been told before in a respectful way. I remember I interviewed an older gentleman, one of the Chin brothers over in Salinas, and he would never talk to me. This was Hughes Chin, one of the multiple Chin brothers. And he was the patriarch. He had all the family histories, he had all the stuff. And I had worked my way through Monterey, Watsonville, and every place, and I'd hit a block in Salinas, and he would not talk to me. Hughes would not. And so the book came out, and then we approached him for the film. We did a film, Jeffrey and
Mark Schwartz.
Right?
Yeah,
and
George.
We put this film together called, ironically, Chinese Gold. Well, that's not a bad title. But in that experience, I reconnected with Hughes. And the book had just come out. Hughes went to every book signing I did. He became a groupie. And finally, just before we shot the film in his house. Remember, he wasn't going to talk about, not going to talk about opium, not going to talk about prostitution, not going to talk about gambling. And we spent all of our time there running film, talking about opium, gambling, and prostitution.
Well, that's because you were asking the questions and not me.
Yeah, he took the conversation there. But he said, when I finally asked him, it was actually, they were changing tape. And I said, Hughes, what was that about? Why is it you wouldn't talk to me? He says, I didn't trust you. He said, we'd had so many people come and talk to us and then take our stories and be abusive and turn it around. He said, I didn't trust you. And that was a profound moment, actually. So that's how it got to where we were. Yeah.
And let me ask, when you went through the rabbit hole back to California, just curious,
Right.
because you're teaching it, you're up in Sacramento Davis then,
Right.
still.
Right.
Where was your first sort of foothold in the story in California that you discovered?
Well,
where you went?
Goldfield.
Okay.
Sure, Goldfield. And again...
In the foothills?
Foothills. And
Okay.
again, with that same sort of sense that the story we were getting wasn't the story that really happened. Because in the early stages of the telling of the gold rush, it was this massive collection of people and everybody got along, and well, that wasn't true. And obviously, as Tom said, they were there doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and were beaten badly. I mean, they got hammered. In fact, I think it's safe to say, if you look back at the immigration history of the United States, I cannot think of any group that has been more vilified and legislated against. They're the only ones that have been excluded by race, and that was in 1882, by race specifically, right? No Chinese. It didn't say no people from Hong Kong or no people from the western part of China or whatever. Anyway, it was the Goldfields that started it. But then when I got here, it was fishing, of course. I mean, that was and the image that Tom just gave you of I've always felt that people are culturally deprived if they can't, in their virtual vision of the coast, imagine junks off the coast, because they were an integral part of it, and they were transshipping. There was a trans-Pacific trade. They were a major part of this, but we've tended to screen out a lot of that. And I have to say, this guy and me and a couple of others that are in this group are working damn hard to get them back in the frame. That's what it's about.
Amen. Yeah. And I just had a fascinating realization here. How many people here have read Cannery Row? Okay? If you haven't, that's your assignment for the next month.
And,
okay?
and that's
We're
also
here
a
at Cabrillo.
book. It's a book, too. It's a book, yeah.
Another book. And an important one to me. I just had a major realization. There's a Chinese merchant in there, Wing Chong, who was based on a real person.
Right.
Jackie and the Yi family.
Right.
Who were squid dryers down there, among other things. And Sandy, when I was young, gave me a copy of one of the labels from their dried squid. that is one of my treasured little items in my office. But there's another Chinese character in that book, and I just realized what your dad was doing. I didn't know your dad was fascinated about the history of Chinese fishing in the region. There's the Chinese fisherman with the straw cap and who flops through several of the scenes with his shoe flopping in that novel.
Right.
And it was your dad's way of just bringing that history into the row without going into it. But that character goes across scenes in the book, reminding us of the past. And the kids in there made fun of him, remember?
Yeah.
The kids in the row made fun of him. But your dad gave him a weight and integrity that forces the reader to engage him. Which leads to my question to you. In one of your books, you talk about the notion that Chinese sailors were here long before the Spanish were here, and that there were Chinese ships here, immigrants coming here before then. What was the root of that history and that notion?
Well, I wouldn't quite call them immigrants because
Yeah.
the Chinese didn't really want to stay. They loved voyaging. They loved what they called treasure voyages. And their treasure voyages weren't so much to gain treasure as to dispense treasure. Ergo, getting other people to become client states. Does that sound familiar to anybody here?
We stole that from him, too.
I know.
Okay.
No, really, it's sort of like, what? I mean, it didn't make sense to me. Right? I'd read about Zhang He's treasure fleet. I had no idea for the longest time until I read 2 or 3 of the books that they had no intention whatsoever of leaving people on shore. That was a terrible thing to do to a relative. Just bring them to Monterey and leave them there, you know. Oh, were you on the football team? No, they wouldn't let me on the football team. And also, you've got to remember, too, Steve was just talking about the oppression of the Chinese. We can thank Hearst for a good part of that as well. What was called the Great Yellow Cause, the idea that they were taking jobs away from itinerant Irishmen always amused me a great deal, because they would take jobs that no Irishman would ever possibly take. But he was correct in one thing. They would take jobs that were lucrative that nobody else wanted to take. And by doing that, they managed to I guess the one major reference, I guess, would be the mafia and garbage collecting. You know, they can control a whole city by determining what garbage is going to be picked up and what garbage is not going to be picked up.
Those are my people, by the way.
You know, I can tell.
Yeah.
It's the hair.
Thank you.
It's the hair.
Yeah, the black limousines coming later in the back. Look out.
And the fact that they didn't. There's something else that's really fascinating about the Chinese. They had a 2-government system going for themselves, both in China and in America. The Tongs, and now, what's the other word I want? Not the Tongs, the larger groups.
Well, the 6 companies, which are...
The 6 companies, no, but I mean, in China, they were called, thank you so much. God, obviously I walked out of that class, and you stuck around for it. The triads, well, the triads were basically a way of governing the Chinese at their own level without basically involving the government. And they got away with all kinds of things doing that. And of course, they were so well practiced at it that when they came to this country, they were already expert at, whipping around the authorities one way or the other. And that's what always fascinated me about them. They did this without ever causing any kind of harm, without ever causing any kind of brutality, except possibly within their own groups, But they were just so quiet at it, like the getting the tailings of gold or running laundries. Now, no one ever thinks about Chinese laundries. Do you remember? Probably none of you know this, But there was a good period of time between the 1840s and possibly 1900 when people sent their laundry all the way to China. I'm not kidding you. They did. They had a double set of clothing, and they pack up one set, and they send it off to be laundered, and they get it back in about 4 or 5 months. All laundered. Now, if you had to wait 4 or 5 months for your laundry now, you'd go, it'd be too much. You couldn't be able to take it. But the Chinese did it, and they said, well, these white people, they really don't have fulongs, is the other term I always like for them, round eyes. These round eyes don't have much patience, so what do you say we start building laundries here? Save them a few weeks. I think that's great. No other white man would have thought of it. What? 9 months to get my laundry back? That's not a big problem. But the idea that you would build your own laundry and get white people to work in it? No, that wasn't going to happen in California. That's why you never hear about Japanese laundries, by the way, because no matter what happened, the Japanese always saw themselves as being superior to the Chinese, which is amazing when you consider that most of what they got from the Chinese. Everything from the rudder to the compass to the lateen sail.
To the written language.
The written language.
Which was a curse for those of us who were trying to learn the language.
It's still a curse.
I know.
I mean, I've tried it again and again, and I've never gotten any farther than about maybe 33 characters. And I just toss up my hands.
That's about 1,600 short, I think.
Well, now I understand why. No, but now I understand why my best friend's parents didn't like me. I couldn't understand an insult they threw me. It was no good leaving me those little notes. Didn't understand them either. That's it.
So here's the deal. When your first book came out, the Soundless Sea,
Right.
Several people said to me, they said, there's some stories in there that you might be interested in seeing. So I reluctantly, and I have to say reluctantly, because some of us, it's a turf thing, right? I don't care who his father was. He's messing with my turf. Of course, not realizing that I was messing with his father's turf, but never mind. And so. That's
because you were telling the truth.
Yeah.
You're a historian.
Yeah. So.
My father became famous by lying through his teeth.
Well, the truth.
A few Oedipal issues here. We'll get to those later.
Yeah. But the idea, because there are several stories, but perhaps the Duchess Wu story, Sing Fat and Duchess Wu, which is the last and the longest, I think, of the stories, is set all over the Chinese communities in the region. But there was a section of it where the main character comes down to Stillwater Cove, and he comes down into Carmel Bay and meets. And up until this time in the story, the names could have been most anybody, all right? But he comes around the corner, and he comes to the house of Jung San Choi. And Jung San Choi, now you have to understand, Jung San Choi, I think, died in like 1913, 1914. But I knew Jung San Choi, all right? I had worked really hard on Jung San Choi, and all of a sudden, this guy has this character coming around the corner, and he's coming to Jung San Choi's house. And it was the darndest experience because, and the only way I can describe this, it's like my character of Jung San Choi was two-dimensional. I knew from the record, I knew some of his descendants. We'd had a big reunion down there at Pebble Beach. So there'd been, but he was, it's like you imagine he's a balloon, but he's deflated. He's flat, all right? Because of what he can do, he blew him up. And all of a sudden, Jung San Choi stood up and took on another dimension. And that's what he can do that in some ways I can't, unless I'm dealing with somebody who's a contemporary or close, or that sort of personal, those internal conversations that people can have. He can mess with them, and I envy that.
He can speculate, but I'm not going to let you cut yourself short. For me, you blew up Jung. For me, and that story does. You give them a dimension. Chinese Gold gives them a framework. They do. I have a picture of him. I have a picture of Jung Sun Choi in my hallway with the rest of my family. There's a famous photo of him.
It's a beautiful
if you don't know,
photograph, too.
It's the one of him and the other unknown fisherman.
Right.
And I have that up in my hallway because Sandy gave that image life to me. So you did, and you do in your book, and he takes it to a new level, different level.
Right.
I got it all from him.
I know, that's good, and I did too. So here you go. And
See, I thought I'd gotten away with this.
okay, well, no.
And here I'm sitting. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. And, but my father used to tell me, he said, son, plagiarism is okay as long as you're only plagiarizing from the best.
Here you go. Yeah.
There we go.
That's very good. That's very good.
I like that.
We'll take that one away. That's
Yeah,
good.
that's good. I got it from you.
That's a bumper sticker.
And actually, the one person who turned me on to you is sitting right over there. Can't see me. Who, when I was first writing this thing, said,
Right.
"What can you tell me about the Chinese in Monterey?" This is many, many years ago now. And he said, "Have you ever read any of your works?" And I said, "No, Sandy Lydon, never heard of her."
Didn't go to Cabrillo. That's the
That's
issue.
right.
Didn't live in Santa Cruz.
I went to prep schools that all the girls were named Sandy.
I got into girls' PE classes with that name.
All right. We'll stop that one there. Okay, back to the issue. I just realized that Chinese character I described was the same generation as Jung San Choi, right?
Yes.
Okay. So your dad had already dealt with him in a certain way and certainly knew about him because your father's got several Chinese characters in his works.
Oh yeah, my favorite one is Lee in East of Eden.
Oh, we'll have that discussion. Do you know who Lee's based on?
No, I don't actually.
Okay. You do.
I think.
Robert Leon Park
Oh, yes.
was the first Chinese to go to
Berkeley.
Berkeley.
Right.
And as you know, the character Lee in East of Eden
Wow.
speaks
Yeah.
broken English to hide from people that he went to Berkeley, right?
Right.
But so he's framed on him, but his voice in there is the voice of Ed Ricketts, okay? And he wrote East of Eden as a way of getting through the death of Ricketts, and then writes Sweet Thursday to get through it again, all right? But it's based on, but it's a full-drawn character, and he's the central figure in the
Right.
book all the way through.
Well, the most, for me at any rate, the most exciting part of that book.
Yep, your mic. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yes?
How do my ankles sound?
What's the sound of one ankle
Well,
clapping? There you
yeah.
go.
God, that drove it out of my mind. Lee's, there's a concept in East of Eden, which is a Hebraic concept called Dishmel, which is thou mayest, thou canst, thou willst. What are you going to do with sin? Well, you can get over it, you may get over it, you may not get over it, who knows? What I loved best about Lee in the story was Lee was basically the housekeeper for the Trask. And he looked after the boys. And it's very funny, that book was dedicated to my brother and myself, which didn't hold out a whole lot of hope for our future.
That's right.
Now I think about it.
I think we're going to go there tonight, all right?
No, it's okay. But it was, so some particular point, Lee admits to the fact that he's, on one of his trips to San Francisco, or San Jose, excuse me, He's gone to see relatives, and they can't tell him what it means either. So all of these old gentlemen get together and decide they're going to study Hebrew in order to answer this question. What does Tishmael actually mean? Thou mayest, thou canst, or thou willst. And in the Bible, or in the Jewish version of the miracles, it's basically a question about what are your chances of getting away with this? You know, what are the chances you're going to get out of this in one piece? And so these old gentlemen, they go and they're what does he call them? They're two pipes a day gentlemen.
There you go. Right.
They have 2 opium pipes a day, just 2, right? And then they sit down and they teach each other Hebrew. And I said, that's Chinese. There you go. That's Chinese. If you don't know, figure it out, you know. And I thought that was just absolutely brilliant. And Steinbeck was fascinated by the Chinese in California. There's no question about it. As a matter of fact, my first inkling that the Chinese had visited California I got from my father, who talked about getting a job at one point with a dredging crew. He wrote a story about this called Johnny Bear. And he was with a dredging crew. I won't get into who Johnny Bear is. That's not really important at the moment. But at any rate, where was I going with this? Yeah. At any rate, along the American River, and that's what they were dredging along the American River. There was the stern of this vessel sticking out from the banks of the American River. And my father said, everybody thought that was a Spanish galleon, but said, I mean, I'm not very smart when it comes to maritime things, but even I knew that wasn't a Spanish galleon because Spanish galleons didn't have rudder posts that were 35 feet long. Wow, okay. So he did his own research, and he figured that ultimately this had to be one of what they call the outlying ships. Zhang Ha's treasure fleet contained ships that were up to 480 feet long, and some ships that were only 100 feet long. And they carried all kinds of things. They carried water, they carried horses, they carried fish, they carried all kinds of things. And I said, wow, that's really fascinating. How did you find out about that? And he said, well, we used to have this cook on our property. And my father's family's ranch was known as Old Starvation Ranch out on Wild Horse Road. You pass it every time you go up and down the coast on Wild Horse Road. And it was just a pitiful excuse for a ranch. But at any rate, it was, they had a Chinese who worked on the property. He was like a man of all talents, who told my father that, because this guy asked my father to explain to him the significance of Columbus. He couldn't figure it out because he wasn't Italian. By the way, either was Columbus. He wasn't, he was Spanish. And he's been a pirate too, which is one of the reasons why he didn't want to know where he came from. And he asked, who Columbus was, and my father tried to explain it to him. He said, oh, no. You're talking about Zhang Ha. And my father goes, what? Oh, you're talking about the great explorer, right? My father said, yes. I said, oh, then you mean Zhang Ha, the great explorer. He found everything. My father found everything. Oh, yes. He found big continent in the south. He found big continent in the north. He goes on and on and on with this list of things that Zhang Ha found and the places he'd sailed to. And my father didn't believe it until this one day on the American River, he saw this stern of this gigantic boat sticking out from, it had been, buried there, God knows how long. But it had a rudder post that was 35 feet long, which would make the stern 35 feet high. Mm-hmm. Well, my father said, that's when I started believing that the Chinese must have been here before. Not only that, but there's another interesting thing that occurred to me. There's only one thing, if you're in a sailing ship, that becomes predominantly necessary any time of the year, and that's fresh water. You got to have it. And you got to know where to get it, and you got to know how to find it. Well, there's another interesting little fantasy about Monterey, that it's the home of the Monterey cypress. It's not. China is the home of the Monterey cypress. And the reason it was planted there, because the Chinese were really brilliant. They knew if they put up any kind of monument to something, put up a pillar, a stone pillar, or anything, it would be gone in no time. On the other hand, if you planted something that everybody and your crew would recognize, cypress, I know cypress, that's where I grow, they would always know where the fresh water was. And where we get the term the Monterey cypress comes from around where the Carmel River empties into the bay. And that's what they did. They planted trees so that from the ocean side, they knew exactly where the water was. Now that's great, great maritime engineering as far as I'm concerned.
Brilliant. But you've raised, I got to follow up with this with a question and then ask Sandy what time he has. Sandy, what time do you have?
It's approaching, the big hand is
Okay.
approaching the 12.
Okay. I want to go 2 more places, excuse me. I want to go, the first place I want to go, you've brought up hearing these stories from your dad, okay? I had a great uncle who I lived with and who was they actually ran against each other. They were in a track meet in Salinas together in 1919, okay? My great uncle went to Santa Cruz High. His father went to Salinas High School. Did your father tell stories all the time, and did you listen to them?
No. And yet, I was always amazed.
Bring it up.
I was always amazed that the things my father never told us. It really stunned, and I still am stunned today. In all the years I knew my father, he never once spoke about his own father.
Wow.
And I've never been able to figure that out.
Okay.
On the other hand, if he knew a story about the invention of the stirrup, or why butterflies have the colors they have, then he knew everything, But when it came to anything intimate about his family, he didn't leave a word. As a matter of fact, it's certainly interesting, though he would reveal the information in another sort of way, was if any of you remember the end of the movie, East of Eden, when the son, Adam, fires the nurse and said, "I'll take care of him myself." That was actually my grandmother, Olive, who had the stroke. And my father put his writing desk outside of her bedroom, and that's where he started writing Grapes of Wrath. And looked after her. Obviously, she needed care all the time. She was a major stroke victim. But he never talked about her, except there were 2 times he talked about her. One is the Dark Watchers. He told me that she was the one that was totally, and this is a woman with no sense of humor whatsoever. None, and no sense of the unique. And she was too Irish for that, but she was the one that convinced him that the Dark Watchers really existed. Because my grandmother rode circuit. She was a circuit riding school teacher in the Big Sur. These were the days when all the kids would gather at one ranch for 1 month and another ranch for another month, and the circuit riding school teachers would go around and teach them in that, that sort of way. But my father would talk about her and the time she killed the wildcat, and that was about it, about all I ever learned about my, about my grandmother, and never heard anything about my grandfather.
Generational, but you've just made the segue that I wanted to head into, and that is
The Dark Watchers.
there they go. And so your grandmother was the one who saw them and told your father about them, and he told you about them. So that's a tale.
Did she see them? She traded with them.
She traded with them. All right. Sandy, let's talk. Okay, I like this. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the Dark Watchers and the Santa Lucias.
So I am on the staff of the Pico Blanco Boy Scout camp, Little Sur River. This is in the 50s. And we had actually heard this story. It was told around the campfires. And I had always believed that it was told to keep the Boy Scouts that we were trying to hold onto the reins on, to keep them in camp at night. In other words, they told you stories. There were wild boar, and there were the Dark Watchers. And they were described in these stories that were told around the campfire as being silent figures seen on ridgetops, usually at a distance. And they were, you saw an outline. You didn't really see detail, but they were silhouettes single, one, and the thought was that they were human, but who knew, all right? So then I'm reading the story Flight that
Right.
your father wrote, and there they are. And he's talking about the Dark Watchers. And I'm starting to do some research in the Sur literature, and I'm encountering them in several different places. And then I hit the story of the 1770 campsite story when the Portola expedition is sitting down next to what is now, we call it Point Lobos, right next to San Jose Creek. And they're waiting for Sarah, who's coming on not a junk. That'd be an interesting
That was
story.
Jungian.
There's a
Okay.
book. Yes, Sarah was Chinese. My
There you
God,
go.
I
He
didn't
probably
realize that.
was.
It's a winner.
It's a winner. Thank you.
We'll have to do the genetic
But anyway, he's
testing.
on the way, and they're all looking out to sea, and they're camped right above the water, right next to the creek, but above the ocean. And somebody says, Capitan, look behind us. And behind them is arrayed a group of, they said, up to 40 men, Indians, all naked, except the guy in the middle, who we learn his name later, actually, in the story, in the record. But he's painted all in black. And they're standing watching the campground, and they're not moving. And so the guys turn around and they say, well, come on down. And they wave trinkets and they do all the things that Spanish explorers did. And they didn't move for hours. And there's a line in there where Crespi says, this is Father Crespi, who's one of the guys scribbling away while all this is going on, taking notes, says, that was the behavior that we saw frequently in this country, was this stoic standing and watching. Standing and watching. Okay, so now in this case, there were a group of them. And eventually they were able to convince them to come down. The problem was that the horses were in the way, and they hadn't seen horses, and they didn't know what that was about. So eventually they got them to come down, and actually Tatlun, who was the guy in the middle, painted black, and Portola actually have a meeting using sign language, and it's a major moment in the history of California. And eventually they all come down, and that's all resolved. So for me, that behavior, that watching, standing, I just figured, and I have no evidence for this. I talked to the Jeffers people, I've talked to everybody about, and now I'm talking to the guy who wrote a book about it, that it's very possible that they would also do this on an individual basis. It's a, sure. And part of it at that time was when they finally got a chance to talk in Castilian, later on, they found out that we didn't know who you were. We thought you were exiles from another country, which they were, in a way, right? It's ironic. So for me, putting that all together, I've spent a lot of time in the Sur country, fishing, and hiking, and I've never had the experience. I've never seen them. That might be on my bucket list. If somebody can arrange that for me, We could do
They've
it
got
here.
pills at
We
the
could do it
local
in
high
Nicene-
schools we can
I
give
won't be
you,
greedy.
yeah.
We can do it in Nicene Marks. I don't care. You could arrange that for me so I could see that. But that's what I think. I think it's local native Indians.
Right, and they're...
I've never seen them either.
I haven't either, but I heard about them since I was a little kid.
Right.
Okay? And I'm told that on some of the stone and cave paintings in the Sur, that there are images very similar to that. Okay? Particularly down in Chumash region, further south.
Okay.
Okay?
The
So-
thing about the Chumash is they're not Native Americans. They're Polynesians.
Okay. There you go.
Whoa.
They paddled a long way to get here.
And the Esalen?
So we've got Chumash are Polynesians.
Yeah.
Sarah's a Chinese.
Yeah, okay.
So this is becoming a very interesting conversation. There's the meat for some books
Oh,
here.
listen, I got even more meat for you. I didn't write a book about the Dark Watchers. This all came about. I have a very, very good friend who I think is one of the best painters. I love California art. I just love it. And a good friend named Ben Brode, fantastic painter. And he comes up here all the time. He loves what he's seeing. One time we came up with our wives, and Bill Post gave us their house. They have a house at the end where the Post Ranch Inn is, right? That they built the house there for them and said, well, we don't use it that much. Why don't you come up and use it for a week? So we came up, and it was a terrible week of weather. It was just awful. And we were sitting around the fireplace. Luckily, they kept on bringing wood to us all the time. And we're sitting around, and I started telling him the story about the Dark Watchers. He said, that sounds crazy. I said, yeah, it does, doesn't it? And I said, but enough people talk about them that I have a tendency to believe that they're probably out there. And if not, then, in its mythology, it's still pretty good stuff, He said, well, tell me that story again. So I told him the story again about how my grandmother was to go, when she'd ride circuit, she'd do tradings with them. Like, she would leave them fruit, right? And then when she came back, she'd find a abalone shell with decorated feathers in it. Just odd little things that they were, but always in the same place. This little crevice in the rocks. They'd find these little things that they would leave for each other. And he said, really, is that true? I said, yeah. So at any rate, Ben Brode came up to Big Sur, and he knew the Post Ranch Inn because Bill Post really loved Ben Brode. And he said, Lucy was still alive then. Old man Post had died, and Lucy was still alive, and he got permission to wander over the property and do sketches and things. So he came back, and he'd made 23 paintings of these paths that Bill Post had carved out of the Big Sur up there on his ranch. And I said, these are incredible. These are really beautiful. I said, yeah, I got more I'm going to do, and I didn't pay much more attention to it. And he said, I got one more trip to make. And he went up to Big Sur, and he came back. And he was totally inculcated with the story I told him about the Dark Watchers. And I said, I looked at the paintings, I said, where are the Dark Watchers? He said, you can't see them? I said, no, but either can you. He said, oh, they're there. As a matter of fact, there's so many of them, they get in your way all the time. They're just all over the place. And I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, Dark Watchers are everywhere. Everywhere I looked, there were Dark Watchers. And I said, I just don't understand that. And he said, well, let me put it to you this way. I'm a painter. It's my job to show the truth in that format. It's your job to look for the Dark Watchers. And indeed, I guess I found them because they existed in his genius. So the book that we wrote, I write the story of the Dark Watchers and my grandmother and everything else, and he goes along and does the paintings. So it's really more of an art book. It's because Ben is just such a phenomenal artist. It's more about the art of the Big Sur as he sees it, right? But he used the excuse of the Dark Watchers to go wandering around.
So do you have copies of that book here?
Yeah.
And they would be for sale for people?
Oh, for hundreds of thousands of dollars, yes.
Beautiful. Well, we will get to that soon, but before we do, I think the Dark Watchers is the way to sort of stop this dialogue. Let's allow people, if you have questions. Do we have microphones to go around? Here's my response, and it sort of leads back to Chinese gold in the 19th century. My family is one of the early fishing families, but not the earliest in the region, okay? There you go. Thank you. And, you know, for some reason, the stereotype of an Italian fisherman makes sense to people, you know? But the idea of Chinese being here fishing before them is somehow incongruous to the mindset. They live across the ocean. It makes sense. For Italians to get here doesn't make sense. I mean, they had to leave Italy, come across the Atlantic, find their way across the continent or around the Horn, and arrive here and stay here. It does not make geographical sense. The current of the North Pacific goes right from China to here. It makes sense. But for some reason, the stereotype has and the reality has always been problematic to accept. So it certainly makes sense and is logical for those people to have been crossing, because ultimately they did.
It's a highway.
Yeah.
It's a highway, and there are so many stories involving, either in the Japanese or Chinese tradition, of what the Japanese call sea drifters, who are fishermen, both in China and in Japan, who go fishing and never come home. You know, they went out for cigarettes and never came back. Well, but giving the name, the dark current, which is Kuroshio, which is what the Japanese call it, or the Great Drain was what the Chinese call it, which is this relentless current that swings up that coast of Asia. We've been waiting for this stuff coming from the earthquake 5 years ago from Japan, and of course we're waiting because we know, and oceanographers know, that there's that current that brings the fishing floats to Oregon. I mean, and we've got Chinese junks coming up and across the Pacific in the 1850s, and we know that there are families who came here. There's nothing to it seems to me, exclude the possibility that they came long before. But I think, as Tom said, Chinese weren't colonists. China's a middle kingdom. Why would you want to go anywhere else? You go for a visit, right? But
you wouldn't want to live there.
You wouldn't want to live there. That's exactly right. Because nobody spoke Chinese, and if they didn't speak Chinese, they must be barbarians. So it's a land of barbarians, and so they would come back.
Imagine anything so unredeemable as that.
Exactly.
There's an animal skin?
So I think, and I think some of the books that have been written to talk about those big junk expeditions are written not organically. I don't know how to describe this, but I've read several of them, and they're working hard to make an argument. So very often they're torquing the stuff, particularly when they're torquing local stuff. They mess around here, and they start talking about things, and the junk up near Calusa, there's a bunch of stuff that they claim. It's a proof that is not convincing, but I believe very, very strongly that they were here before, and there's no reason why they wouldn't be.
Right. I mean, it's almost as if it would be almost a miracle if they weren't here before.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing is that the narrative that we tell starts on the east coast of North America and comes across, and this then becomes the end of the story. Even our dear friend Jim Houston even used that metaphor, remember, when he talked about the edge of the continent. that somehow we all come here and then this is it, right? When for many people coming to America, it's the other way. This is the beginning of the story. And so if we've got a kind of a New York, hey, no, we're voting last, right? We're voting last on the 7th of June. Sure, people say, why is California voting last? Well, that's just because that's the end of the continent, the end of the story.
But both of you have, and Jim Houston, God bless him, use this term, and both of you have it, and both of your lives reflect it, and both of your writings are part of what I would call a Pacific Rim consciousness.
Right.
You went to Vietnam. Do you feel that had an early resonance with your understanding?
Well, no, I'd already pretty much into it. But
You had it by then?
I had it before then, yeah.
Okay.
And I did not that, but I really like the Vietnamese. I don't care what anybody else says.
Yeah, we got to.
Put mic up. Put your mic
Sorry.
up.
I didn't want to listen to my groin, but
Well, now we're getting interesting, okay?
no, I'm just not used to holding these things at all, you know?
Okay. Yeah, the question I had asked was about whether or not your Vietnam experience helped give you a Pacific Rim. You had it before.
I was pretty much into my theories by that point, which is one of the reasons why I found Vietnam so interesting. And I've always been an amateur enthusiast of maritime history. I think the largest, my wife will guarantee this, the largest section of my book collection, which is quite extensive, is on maritime histories from all over the world.
And might I recommend to the audience that the Silver Lotus has a lot of wonderful maritime stuff in it.
Oh yeah, that's the more stuff I got from the Cantonese.
Yeah.
Who most people don't just off an aside. Do you know that the Chinese at one point had more pirates than most navies had enlisted men? No, really, it's amazing. At one point there were like 15,000 pirates traveling up and down the coast, and the most famous pirate of them all was a woman. She was. Her husband had been a pirate, and when he died, she inherited the business. Tell me about it.
What a concept.
Well, finally, she became so powerful. Actually, the whole business of piracy in China became so hardcore that the government had to make a deal with her. They said, "Okay, you don't fool with us, and we won't fool with you." Sort of like kind of deal, and it worked out for many long years. There's something else very interesting about mentioning Chinese in Mexico.
Okay, what he was talking about was, to make it quick, was the link between the Philippines and Mexico, and there's in the 1700s, right? Yeah, 17th century. There are Chinese builders identified in Mexico as El Chino. All right? I mean, the whole Manila, right? Trade.
The China ships.
Is China ships.
They're called the China ships.
And is the reason for the Spanish coming here. I mean, it's...
They're just big junks.
Yeah.
The design of a Spanish galleon with its behind sitting way up in the air like that, they're junks built by Chinese junk builders in the Philippines.
Yep, they're brilliant too. One of the things that always impressed me so much about the Chinese maritime skills pretty much was the fact that they were experts in wood. They could identify wood by the smell. Believe it or not, they could. They could tell you what kind of wood it was by the very smell of the wood. And there's also something else about the Chinese junk builders. There's only one reason to take apart a junk, and that's to get parts for a new junk. Literally, I mean, no junk ever goes into the future with just its own staples onto it. Parts of other junks are incorporated into it. It's considered part of the magic, but it's also considered part of the strength. You're not going to go throw away a really good I-beam of iron if you've got a use for it. And the Chinese felt the same way about woods. And they were just really brilliant at that kind of thing. Now, the other thing I want to ask myself is, why would anybody go out and build a junk 480 feet long if they didn't have any reason for it? You know, you got to be, this very day, as a matter of fact, if you wanted, the Chinese and the Vietnamese don't get along at all, never have gotten along. And one of the reasons the Vietnamese have always disliked the Chinese was because they literally ripped the forests of Vietnam apart to get the wood to build the Chinese junk fleet. It was called the treasure fleet. As I said, it wasn't really a treasure going out. It was not even treasure coming in. It was just the idea that they could bribe client states with the treasures they brought. They found all kinds of just odd and strange, wonderful things. Someone, I think in the 1950s, discovered a whole cache of Chinese gold coins on the shores of Australia. You know, little things like this all over the place. Whoa, where did that come from? Also, China. I mean, bone China was found in the possession of Australian Aborigines. Wow, okay. It just goes on and on and on and on. Because if we're going to believe one, then we have to believe the other. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever bothered to think about the Egyptian role, maritime role, in the history of the world, okay? Until about 8 or 9 years ago, I believe, a very credentialed German anthropologist and chemist discovered that the two main chemicals used in the preservation of bodies was coca and tobacco. None of those plants are indigenous to Egypt. They're only indigenous to the New World. How did it get from the New World to the Old World? The chemistry is all perfect. I mean, I've read the chemistry reports. They're all perfect. How did they do it? Now, we see Egyptian vessels on jars and everything else. Well, they must have been able to trade overseas, or else they couldn't have gotten these drugs. And they were used specifically for embalming. They didn't smoke tobacco. They didn't snort cocaine. They just use it for this one particular reason.
We have a question here, and
So yeah, I understand that the dialogue has been cut short due to the fact that
Racial vanity.
I didn't say it.
No, it really is. I mean, I'm surprised sometimes that the white cultures have never sort of looked back on themselves and say, this is the most absurd thing it was ever thought of. You know, my God, how do we come up with this story? It's ongoing. And as my father used to say, human beings have never found anything quite so challenging as a large body of water. And it's true. They'll do anything to get across it. They'll swim across it. They'll put a raft across it. What's the first thing that people trapped on a desert island want to do? Build a raft. I thought that was just so amazing, and it's really, really true. If there's a chance you can get across it and see what's on the other side, human beings will do it. And I don't care what the culture is from. I mean, I remember Thorl Heyerdahl. Of course, he was completely wrong about his theory about how Easter Island was occupied, but he wasn't wrong insofar that by suggesting that a balsa raft could make it. It did make it. It was going in the wrong direction. It wasn't going South America to Easter Island. It was going from Easter Island to South America. And the other thing that did top me off too, my father was very fond of this theory, and that is, if any of you know anything about Aztec culture, you'll know there are no dragons in Aztec culture. There's snakes, but there are no dragons, except for one. And it turns out to be the same symbol that's put on the front of the largest of Zhang He's fleet. And that's, how would I put it? Quetzalcoatl. Do you know who Quetzalcoatl is? The rain god? Quetzalcoatl, it looks like, he even got that sort of moppet collar on him, that very strange looking, flowery collar going around him. But it's the only dragon in Mayan culture. And yet it's all over the place on the bows of Chinese ships. And when asked, where did this god come from, they constantly pointed to the east. And that's where they came from. And they've been coming again. And every once in a while they come again, which is why they thought the Spaniards might be them again. Of course they weren't, but that's another tragedy.
Is there other evidence of early Buddhist arrival here in the States on the West Coast from, would you say, 485, the 5th century? Yeah.
Well, there's somewhere in Chinese gold early on, I raised this whole issue. And the Stan Steiner book, which came out now 25, 30 years ago, called Fusang, in which Mr. Steiner develops, I think, rather eloquently. And then there's an earlier, Chapman did an earlier book using the evidence that the Anza expedition saw on the beach. I mean, there's a number of things that they pieced together to support the idea that they came in the 5th century. This is early. Yeah, but I don't know, because it was beyond my expertise and my skill at the time, I left the point. Actually, I think I even said in the book that this will be for future. This is the cop-out. This will be for future historians to determine. And I thought that with all of the opening of the records and things that would be coming in the People's Republic, that we would get some better triangulation on some of this. We haven't. So I think still at the moment it's and I'm not sure, and I don't mean to be dismissive here, but I'm not sure it matters. I think what matters is the idea that it really could have. Certainly it could have, and there's everything to point that it could have, and to begin to look at the Pacific a different way, to look at it as a transportation route. I spend a lot of time in Japan, and we're moving Japanese stories back and forth. Tim Thomas, who's here, who does a lot of work in Monterey, we take the stories back and forth now. We're almost trans-Pacific people because we're sharing, because you have to understand, until recently, the people who came here from those coasts weren't really significant in the history of those places. So they didn't pay much attention to it. Uncle Frank went away and never came back. Okay. So that now we begin to share. I mean, when we tell stories about the Japanese or Chinese here back in Japan, they're amazed because from their perspective, it's like doing something about, say, immigrants from the United States who then create enclaves somewhere else. I mean, it's something generally you don't do. But I think now that we're seeing, because there's so much stuff on both sides of the Pacific that each can begin to share. Most Asian American history people spend all their time focusing here. What we've learned, and we've learned this in the last 15, 20 years, is that there's a whole lot of stuff having to do with the communities here in Japan, because they sent letters home, they sent photographs. There's so much stuff that doesn't exist anymore, because at the beginning of World War II, the Japanese community destroyed all their Japanese records here. That all of a sudden we're finding out that there's more in Japan about here than there is here about here. Does that make any sense? I don't think it makes any sense.
Yeah. And on that note, My cousin Kenny likes to say, more will be revealed. It's a very wise phrase. We'll get to that later. But you two gentlemen have revealed a great deal, not only tonight, but in your writings. And I think for me, what got re-inspired again was this understanding of breaking what is truly been a false narrative about U.S. history, certainly the history of this region, but really a global concept of history that we often don't embrace, and both of you have, and have given us this rich, wonderful gift that we can celebrate right now with your books. And
particularly right now.
yes.
Particularly right
Thank
now.
you.
In
Thank you.
2016, right here.
Yeah.
Now.
Yes, absolutely. At this moment.
At this moment.
This crazy moment in American history, yes. And so I would like to thank Cabrillo and the Cabrillo Foundation and all the people who worked to make this evening a possibility, and to thank all of you for being here tonight, and in particular to thank these two gentlemen who have given so much back to our region and to all of us their great gift. Thank you.